Hey knife nuts, you ever run across a knife that you're just completely not interested in, and then you get one in your hands and much to your surprise you start to fall in love with it? Well, I got one in my hands right now. Stick around, we'll talk about it. Hi gang, Rob here. It is the morning of August 20, 2014. And yes, I have a knife that I would have never given a second look, but ended up loving in my hand this morning. And this one, courtesy of my sharpening customer Paul, it is the Spyderco Manix 2 lightweight. Notice that the handle is a little different. It's not that translucent blue, it's sort of a solid blue with maybe just a hint of purple in it. And not only is it made in Golden, Colorado, USA earth, but the blade steel is CPM S110V. Not Carpenter BD1, but Crucible CPM S110V. So there's a reason I've known about this knife for a little bit now. There's a reason I haven't been interested in it. Actually, there are a couple. First of all, those of you who have been following my channel for any length of time know I am not a huge fan of polymer handled Spydercos with that volcano grip. Not necessarily because the grip doesn't work properly, because it does. I just think they're ugly. I think they're kind of flimsy, and especially when they're pinned or riveted together, I just think they're cheesy in general. Also, and this would be one, also I am not a fan of let's say steels who take edge retention to a ridiculous level at the expense of sharpenability and the ultimate sharpness they can achieve. Into that class I would put steels like Elmax S90V, to a degree Carpenter CTS 204P, not quite as bad as some of the others. And I had no experience until about a week ago, 2 weeks ago, sharpening S110V. I kind of thought, and this is out of my own ignorance, just by the numbering designation, I thought, well, if S90V is bad and a nightmare to work with, S110V must be worse. Well, I stand corrected. And we'll get into all that as we progress in this video. And thank you, Paul, for sending this to me to sharpen, because my mind has been changed a little bit. Actually, I've worked with two S110V knives in the last week, one being a Forum knife Native 5. I'll wipe this blade a little bit. As I'm wiping, let's kind of start from the beginning of the Manix saga. This is a Manix 2 lightweight. The Manix is, I don't know if it's the first knife, but certainly one of the first knives designed by Eric Glesser. You can see his logo, his maker's mark, at the top of the blade, right next to the Golden, Colorado insignia. So the Manix was sort of Eric's first knife, and in its original form it was steel lined, G10 handled, had a larger knob or pommel at the back, much like a Manix 2 XL has, and it was a lockback. The knife didn't sell extremely well. It was a little blocky in hand, I think, and lockbacks were sort of falling out of fashion, maybe a little bit. And then what, 3 or 4 years ago, we saw the Manix 2. Oh, by the way, in the lockback version, the Manix 1 incarnation, there was also a mini Manix, which was a little smaller than this knife, but had the same handle profile with this small pommel. So anyway, 3 or 4 years ago, Spyderco releases the second version, and one thing about Eric Glesser, he is a tweaker. When one of his designs just isn't quite hitting the mark or striking a chord with buyers, he goes back, he listens, man. He I think follows forums and finds out what guys like and don't like about his knives, and he has no pride in this regard. If it needs tweaked, he tweaks it. So the Manix 2 comes out, and with this narrower pommel, and they went away from the back lock or the mid lock in favor of this caged ball bearing lock, which, as many of you know, there is a ball bearing housed in this polymer carriage that pulls back. Let's see if I can do that with my index finger so you can see it move. There you go. The ball slides onto a shelf on the back of the blade tang and locks the knife open, much like a Benchmade axis lock does. But instead of using omega springs around the ends of a bar, we use a ball bearing inside a plastic carriage with a spring around a pin, very much like the spring in a ballpoint pen. In fact, should your spring break, not in this knife because it's pinned, but in a screw together Manix, you can actually take the spring out of a ballpoint pen and put it in here to make the knife work. Now, the lock is very strong. Nobody's going to dispute that. Does it have the ease of manipulation that a Benchmade axis lock does? Certainly not when the knives are new. When they're new, you almost need to pinch them with thumb and forefinger and try to bury the pommel in the palm of your hand and hope your action is adjusted right and you can flick them open and close like you can an axis lock, but they're not as ergonomically friendly. You could make the case that they're stronger and more reliable, but they're not as ergonomically friendly as the axis locks are. But with practice, you get there. Wipe again, satin finishes and fingerprints. The bane of the existence of an obsessive compulsive. So that the Manix 2 originally, the second version originally came out with stainless steel liners, G10 handle scales, a steel housing, I guess, and front spacer that houses the caged ball bearing lock mechanism. And I believe they were in, gosh, I think they were in S30V right out of the gate. No, they weren't. They were in 154 CM. And they were hollow saber ground. So the parallel flats came down to about here. What is this? 1/8 inch stock or so, maybe a tad thicker. And then a very abrupt, kind of deep hollow grind, and frankly the blades were not aesthetically very pleasing and they weren't very good cutters. You had all this wasted full thickness stock up here. They didn't slice well. I never liked them. Didn't even think the ergonomics were very good. I was wrong about that. Then maybe 2 or 3 years ago, the Manix 2 XL was released, which was a full 4-inch blade. This one is about 3 3/8 in the normal size Manix. And I thought, well, the Manix has now arrived. They make it in the 4-inch version. I got to get that. It was a full flat ground S30V blade. I had one. You guys can go back and check out my videos on that. It's a 2-part review, and I had my issues with that knife. I still do. It also used the the bushing pivot, much like the Super Leaf, the Super Hawk, and the Paramilitary 2, which by design is supposed to be a pivot you can assemble tight and have the action work correctly. And frankly, after several years of experience with that with that pivot, I hate to say this because I am a well-documented Spyderco fanboy, but the variability in the process of producing the bushing pivot leads to many a disappointed Spyderco owner, because the tolerancing and process for producing that pivot are not repeatable, and many bushing pivoted Spyderco knives are just not able to be tuned so they work properly. In 2014, it's a rare thing to get a new Paramilitary 2 with a pivot that works right. They have blade centering issues, they have side-to-side play issues, and they have pivot tightness and looseness issues. I did with my XL. Also, I found that the construction of the handle, even though it was G10 with stainless steel liners, was far too flimsy for the size of the knife. Okay, that brings us to this one, doesn't it? 3 3/8 inch blade out of CPM S110V, a handle 4 11/16 and FRN with volcano grip, riveted construction, can't take it apart and service it. The pivot is adjustable, and it's standard adjustable pivot. Just phosphor brown washers, screw it together till it's tight enough to suit you, and away you go. Loctite the screw and forget it. So if my Manix 2 XL with G10 handle scales and stainless steel liners was too flimsy, certainly this version with an unlined FRN handle must be a kid's toy and therefore completely worthless, right? Wrong. I actually think this blade shape is far more useful at 3 3/8 inches than it is at nearly 4 inches. Because it is scaled down in length from the XL, I don't mind that the handle is able to be flexed a little bit. It doesn't feel like an overly floppy knife as I torque the blade side to side. You can feel the knife flex, just like any Endura, Delica, Salt, anything that uses this handle, even the steel line ones, they do flex, but not to a point where it bothers you. And guys, the knife weighs 2.9 ounces by my scale. For a large EDC blade, even an emergency tactical blade, that lock's not going to, yes, the handle will flex if you're torquing on it, but it's not going to fold on your hands if you want to open up a bad guy or probe his chest cavity with the tip if he's got it coming. Of all the Manixes I've handled, never had a first generation lightweight because I'm not a fan of that BD1 steel. But of all the Manixes I've ever handled, I like this one the best. You can get to the pivot mechanism even though you can't take the handle apart. The clip stays true to the Manix line with the folded wire clip that is reversible tip up, left or right carry, which is perfect for me. Knife is totally ambidextrous in that regard. The lock operates exactly the same way, no matter which side of the knife you're operating it from. The action on this knife is, for me, perfect. It is almost a free dropper, but it's not going to wantonly swing close on your fingers if they happen to be in the way. It takes a little user input to get it to close. So, it's a handle and a construction I really didn't think I would like. Thought it was kind of substandard for the price point. It's extremely well executed. I stand corrected. Now for the steel. My contempt prior to investigation for S110V makes me feel a little silly. I actually prefer it to S90, and the differences are, and I'm not gonna dig out the chemistry chart for you. It's got a little more carbon than S90V, about 3%. It's the trace elements that really change. There's a bunch more molybdenum, a bunch more vanadium, and there is a touch of niobium in this knife. So you still get great carbide formation. Trying to remember. There might be a little more chromium too. A little more or a little less, I'm not sure which, but you get increased toughness over S90V. And I think with that niobium in there, a little better machinability. Still a steel capable of achieving a super high hardness and great edge retention, but from a grindability standpoint, as you can see, it doesn't take, you know, the same kind of polish as a ZDP 189 does, or certainly not like a D2 or a 1095 or an OS8. Not even as good as S30V and S35VN. However, I do think it takes a little better polish than S90, a little higher grindability, and I think it's capable of achieving a little higher initial sharpness than S90. That's pretty silent going through the paper. Very little snagging or tearing, and very nice S-curve. It's, you know, for a super edge retention, modern, carbide rich, powdered steel, this stuff I like. It's made me make a mess, hasn't it? There are not too many steels in this sort of caliber that I really get done sharpening and I think, man, that's a nice edge. But on this one, man, that's a nice edge. Not sure what Rockwell hardness Spyderco heat treats this to, but they seem to have really struck the balance with this steel. It does seem that when Spyderco decides to use a new steel in their lineup, they get it right before they produce it. I've never seen a Spyderco knife in any steel with a bad heat treat that didn't seem to get the most out of the material used. So good job once again, guys. And Eric, great job using old technology and modern materials and coming up with a great knife. I like this thing. What a great carryable size, much more so than the XL, and more so than the standard Manix 2. Let's face it, guys, even the handle construction, the Manix 2s and Manix 2 XLs, even though they're G10 and steel lined, they're not rigid. They're disappointingly floppy. The normal size Manix 2 is better than the XL, but not appreciably better than this knife. I like it. Paul, this one's going in the mail this morning on its way back to you. Thanks for letting me test drive it for a few days, and I hope you're happy with the edge. I think you will be. That's all for now. Grace to you and peace, my friends, from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. And remember the Word and Paul's Manix 2 lightweight, or sharp.